Welcome to Newsmax TV. I'm Kathleen Walter. We're joined by Mauricio Claver-Caron, Executive Director of Cuba Democracy Public Advocacy, a nonprofit organization that lobbies to keep the U.S. embargo on Cuba in place. He also serves on the board of directors of the U.S.-Cuba Democracy PAC, which is among the largest foreign policy political action committees in the United States. An attorney, Mauricio was recognized recently by Poder magazine as one of 20 entrepreneurs, executives, leaders and artists under 40 who are shaping the future of the U.S. and the world. Welcome to Newsmax TV, Mauricio.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us. President Obama offered Cuba a new beginning in relations with the U.S. U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton came out saying that the old U.S. policy had failed. We'd like to get your thoughts. Is the Obama administration's policy any better?
Well, I think that the administration has been learning as it's been going along. They came in with the president himself had never really had much experience in dealing with Cuba and Cuba policy. He has some people around him that had very ideological views in regards to how to deal with Cuba and Cuba policy and the regime in Cuba. But he's been learning about the intransigence really of this regime and the fact that it's really not a reliable or rational partner to deal with, as they have in regards to many regimes around the world. I don't criticize their effort to try to do something different and send a signal that, okay, we're willing to talk, we're willing to engage. Now, the problem is with regimes like Cuba, Iran, North Korea, Burma, these aren't rational partners. These are people that have, very deep anti-American views, that have huge antagonisms to the United States and to American foreign policy, and therefore are not trustworthy partners. In so doing, the administration has done what it promised to do during the campaign. It essentially changed the limitations on Cuban-American visits to Cuba, basically to visit family members, and on some of the remittances. Kind of an example of how they've kind of been learning as it's gone along is during the announcement for lifting the regulations on, for changing the regulations on family visits and remittances. At the beginning they said, oh, we want to have unlimited remittances. Well, they learned as the process went along that the Castro regime would take 30 to 40% off of every dollar that entered the island, right off the top, 30% right off the top of every dollar that entered the island, and put it right into his coffers. Eventually all 100% ends up, because it's a totalitarian regime and a totalitarian economy, so any money that's used will end up in the regime's hands. But right off the top, just through the exchange and just through the wiring, the regime takes 30% off the top. Well, a couple of days later, during the summit in Trinidad, actually then the president came out and said one thing that the regime could do to show goodwill would be to eliminate this 30% it takes off right off the top. Well, they haven't done that yet. So the president has done what he promised during the campaign. He has tried to, at least stylistically, have a different approach and a more of an open hand approach, as he said. But as we've seen recently, and as now the president himself has admitted, the Cuban regime's fist remains very clenched, and the repression has increased. This is not a rational partner, and they've quickly now come to notice that.
So the United States adopted this policy of engagement or pseudo-engagement, made some concessions to Cuba with the hope that it would begin to take gradual steps toward democracy. We're not seeing that happening at all.
Not on the regimes, not because the regime wants to. Obviously, this is an entrenched regime. I mean, it's an entrenched military dictatorship. Now, what is happening in Cuba is that there is a domestic pro-democracy movement, a domestic opposition movement, which increasingly is more active, is more outspoken, has undertaken huge sacrifices. You have some of the leadership on hunger strikes, some political prisoners, as now recently in February, Orlando Zapata Tamayo died after a 45-day hunger strike, basically protesting the abuses and tortures that we're receiving in prison. I mean, the pro-democracy movement is a viable alternative, it's a viable source, and it's out there on a daily basis, challenging the regime, pushing the regime's limits. And that's what basically the regime is reacting to.
So do you think that this movement by the civil society then could, in effect, affect a regime change?
It is definitely, there's nothing that the Castro regime for many years, for decades, has tried to put out the story that there's no viable opposition in Cuba, that basically they are it. Opponents of U.S. policy here in the United States have taken that call and have used it as part of their advocacy. So they say, we have to deal with the Castro regime. And I think that that's where the administration at the beginning was going. We have to deal with this Castro regime because there is no alternative. Well, that's not true. there is a viable alternative. We've seen this pro-democracy movement. We've seen these leaders. We've seen the ladies in white every week on Sunday marching for basically the release of their husbands, of their sons, of their other relatives that are in prison. We've seen a united front and an increased advocacy almost on a daily basis. That's a viable alternative. Václav Havel, who was the former dissident leader in the Czech and now the Czech Republic and the former Czechoslovakia, who then became president, he himself recognized, as have many other Eastern European leaders, that the opposition movement in Cuba today is actually larger and more active and more well known than some of the opposition movement in Eastern Europe was. And in practically every country in Eastern Europe, it wasn't regime individuals and sectors that became leaders after. It was actually opposition leaders and pro-democracy advocates that then took the reins of power, be it Václav Havel in the former Czechoslovakia, be it Lech Walesa in Poland, etc.
Now, the U.S. maintains a long-standing trade embargo on Cuba, and because both governments remain at odds over human rights issues and other issues, that embargo has stayed. And I know that that is something that is very important to your organization because it lobbies to keep that embargo in place. Why is this embargo so important, and has it achieved the desired results?
Well, basically, U.S. policy requires it's codified into law. It was codified into law in 1996, and it basically says that for the United States to have normal trading relations with Cuba and this regime, essentially, because we're not talking about trading with the Cuban people. Cuba is a totalitarian regime in which everything from politics to the economy to social activities is controlled by the government. There's only 3 countries in the world that are like this: North Korea, Cuba, and Burma. So basically, in order to have that normal relationship, that 3 things have to occur. First, the unconditional release of all political prisoners. Secondly, the recognition of certain fundamental human rights, including the freedom of the press, freedom of association, etc. And third, the legalization of the opposition parties. We're not asking for something huge. This is the one anomaly in this hemisphere.
Mauricio, there are critics both within Congress and in the international community who say that the embargo actually hurts Cubans, depriving them of needed food and medicines, etc. How do you respond to that?
Well, what we've seen throughout the world, all of the tourism, all of the trade that the Europeans, Canadians, etc., countries in this hemisphere have provided to the regime throughout the 90s. Before that, when the Soviets provided more aid to Cuba in 30 years than what all of Europe received during the Marshall Plan, none of that went to the benefit of the Cuban people. The Cuban people were still in the dire situation that they are today. So we've seen that income doesn't work. Comparisons in other countries, we saw in the late 1990s, South Korea and North Korea. You had a sunshine policy that basically had engagement, and that somehow that engagement and increased business and trade and normalization was going to help North Korea and lead North Korea to reform and help the North Korean people. Well, all that did was strengthen the North Korean regime and make it a nuclear menace, but it didn't help the North Korean people any. The one barrier to the well-being of the Cuban people is that regime. There's that one level that needs to be penetrated in order for things to be better for the Cuban people. And until there's an opening in that regime, until that totalitarianness creeps open, there's just really no way to directly help the Cuban people. That being said, the United States is the largest provider of humanitarian aid to Cuba in the entire world. Actually, the United States provides more humanitarian aid to Cuba than all of the countries in the world put together. Mm-hmm. So knowing that even collaterally there is some damage, because at the end of the day, some of that is filtered and goes to the regime, we still want to help the people because this is a humanitarian country and we want to help the Cuban people to ease that burden of that regime as much as possible. Yet it's very difficult to do when everything has to go through Castro's funnel.
Now, President Obama seems intent on pacifying the international community, and the international community has been putting a lot of pressure on the U.S., and especially in recent years, to lift the embargo. What are the chances that President Obama will try to lift the embargo? Well,
the president has said that he will not lift sanctions, and actually he cannot lift sanctions by law until those conditions that we had talked about previously were met. So therefore, he cannot unilaterally do so without Congress.
The U.S. lists Cuba as a state sponsor of terrorism, but there's increasing concern by terrorism experts about the Castro brothers' seemingly cozy relationship with Venezuela's Hugo Chavez and Iran's Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. To what extent do you think those relationships hurt the United States?
Very much so. I mean, what's interesting is that all the news is focused on Chavez, and Chavez being now the greatest regional menace. And we see that the daily fights to Iran. We've now seen from the Pentagon report the existence of Iranian shock troops of the Qadir brigades in Venezuela. And it all goes back to basically the influence. Hugo Chavez didn't spring out of nowhere. When Hugo Chavez was released from jail in Venezuela due to a failed coup attempt in the early 90s, he went to Cuba. And he spent years in Cuba until he returned to Venezuela. And then in 1998, it came to power, democratically elected, speaking completely different than he does now. And he's gone radicalizing himself more and more. The Cuban government essentially controls the Venezuelan government. All of the major sectors, from the military to intelligence to security, are controlled by Cuban operatives. It's not the other way around. There's not Venezuelans advising, Fidel Castro and Raul Castro on how to, deal with Cuba. It's Cuban generals, Cuban intelligence experts, etc., that are essentially overseeing Hugo Chavez's operation and Venezuela's intelligence and military operations.
Right now, an American contractor remains jailed in Cuba. He's been in prison for about 6 months. So far, no criminal charges have been filed. The Cuban government arrested him, suspecting him of spying. We have not heard a lot about this case in the media. Should the United States be doing more to get this contractor home?
Well, I trust that the United States is doing everything it can, and I trust the State Department at its word that they bring this up regularly, that they really have made this a priority almost for the United States. Definitely this gentleman, Alan Gross is his name, has been arrested since December 3rd. He's had absolutely no due process, and actually just last week, the Cuban government said that they don't have any charges to present against him, and so he's basically being held without charges indefinitely. And what he was actually doing in Cuba was helping the Jewish community in Cuba, which is somewhat apolitical actually, connect to the internet.
All right, Mauricio Claver Caron, thanks so much for joining us. We enjoyed having you here on Newsmax TV.
Thank you so much, appreciate it.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.